Sometimes life forces us into corners we never saw coming, and the choices we make in those desperate moments define who we truly are. In a world where trust is scarce and second chances are rarer still, two broken souls are about to discover that redemption often comes in the most unexpected forms. Wealthy cattle baron Thaddeus Crane needs a wife in 30 days to keep his inheritance. Clara Rose sits in jail, facing the gallows for a murder she claims she didn't commit. He offers her marriage and freedom. She offers him the solution to his problem. But as their arrangement unfolds, Thaddeus begins questioning Clara's guilt, and Clara starts seeing past his cold exterior. When the real truth emerges and danger closes in, their fake marriage becomes achingly real. What happens when a man who's always valued money above all else discovers that some things are worth more than gold? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Bluff, a frontier town that had seen better days but still carried the stubborn hope of those who refused to give up on their piece of the American dream. The year was 1885, and the West was still wild enough to swallow a man's dreams or make them come true, depending on his courage and the cards fate dealt him. At the edge of town, where the cobblestones gave way to dirt roads that stretched toward endless horizons, stood the offices of Whitmore Associates, the only law firm within 100 miles that dealt with matters of significant wealth. Inside the modest building, behind a desk worn smooth by decades of important documents and difficult conversations, sat Thaddeus Crane, a man whose very presence commanded respect without demanding it. At 35, Thaddeus possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of long days under the prairie sun and nights spent making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. His dark hair showed premature threads of silver at the temples, and his deep-set brown eyes held the weight of a man who had learned that money could solve most problems but couldn't fill the emptiness that settled in a person's soul when they realized they had no one to share their success with. The Crane Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in 3 counties, supporting herds that numbered in the thousands and employed nearly 50 men year-round. Thaddeus had built this empire from the modest foundation his uncle Jonathan had left him 12 years ago, a single section of land and a handful of cattle. Through careful planning, shrewd business deals, and a work ethic that put most men to shame, he had transformed a small inheritance into one of the largest and most profitable ranching operations in the territory. But success, as Thaddeus had learned, was a lonesome companion. The leather-bound document before him crackled as he turned its pages, each word of his uncle's last will and testament striking him like a physical blow. Jonathan Crane had been more than an uncle. He had been the father Thaddeus never knew, the mentor who taught him that land was more than dirt and grass, that it was legacy, responsibility, and the foundation upon which a man built his life's work. "I trust this comes as no surprise, Mr. Crane," said Edgar Whitmore, the elderly lawyer whose white whiskers and gentle manner couldn't quite hide the sharp intelligence in his pale blue eyes. "Your uncle spoke of this arrangement many times in recent years." Thaddeus read the relevant passage again, though the words were already burned into his memory. "To my nephew, Thaddeus Crane, I leave the entirety of my holdings, including the Diamond Bar Ranch, all livestock, equipment, and the sum of $50,000 in gold, held in trust at First National Bank of Denver. However, this bequest is conditional upon his marriage to a woman of good character within 1 year of my death. Should he fail to meet this condition, half of all holdings shall pass to the Territorial Land Development Company." The Territorial Land Development Company. Thaddeus knew them well, a group of Eastern investors who had been circling the best ranches in the territory like vultures, waiting for any opportunity to acquire prime grazing land for their railroad expansion plans. His uncle's conditional bequest had been his way of ensuring the family legacy would continue through marriage and, presumably, children who would carry the Crane name forward. The clause was his attempt to ensure you wouldn't spend your life alone. Whitmore continued, his voice gentle but firm. He worried about you, son, said you were too busy building an empire to build a family. Thaddeus folded the will carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. When did he die? 3 weeks ago, in his sleep. The funeral was small, as he requested. The 30-day notice period began the day after his burial. Whitmore consulted his pocket watch, which means you have exactly 7 days to fulfill the condition. 7 days. The weight of that deadline settled on Thaddeus like a stone. He had known this moment would come. Eventually, Jonathan had hinted at it often enough, but somehow he had always imagined he would have more time. Time to court a suitable woman, time to build the kind of relationship that might grow into genuine affection. Time to do things properly. There is another matter, Whitmore said, sliding a smaller envelope across the desk. Your uncle left specific instructions about Clara Rose. Thaddeus looked up sharply. Clara Rose? The woman in Sheriff Murphy's jail? The very one. Jonathan visited her several times before his death. He seemed to believe strongly in her innocence. Whitmore's weathered hands smoothed the envelope. He asked that I ensure you knew the full circumstances of her case before making any judgments. Clara Rose. Even those who had never seen her knew her story. 3 months ago, she had arrived in Redemption Bluff on the evening stage, a striking woman with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She had taken a room at the boarding house and kept to herself, which in a town like Redemption Bluff was enough to generate whispers and speculation. The whispers had turned to gasps of shock when Benjamin Fletcher, a traveling merchant and known gambler, was found dead in his hotel room with a knife in his back. Clara Rose had been found unconscious in the alley behind the hotel, blood on her dress and Fletcher's wallet in her possession. The evidence seemed damning, and Sheriff Murphy, a decent man but not one for complicated investigations, had arrested her on the spot. She was scheduled to hang in 10 days. What did Uncle Jonathan learn about her case? Thaddeus asked, though part of him already suspected where this conversation was headed. Read his letter, Whitmore said. He was quite thorough in his investigation. Thaddeus broke the seal and unfolded the familiar handwriting, his uncle's voice seeming to speak from beyond the grave. My dear nephew, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are facing the most important decision of your life. I know the marriage clause seems harsh, perhaps even manipulative, but I have watched you build walls around your heart that grow taller each year. You are a good man, Thaddeus, but goodness without companionship becomes a burden that will eventually crush even the strongest soul. I write to you about Clara Rose not because I wish to influence your choice of bride, but because I believe her story intersects with your destiny in ways that neither of you yet understand. I have spent considerable time investigating her case, and I am convinced beyond doubt that she is innocent of Benjamin Fletcher's murder. The evidence against her is circumstantial and poorly examined. Fletcher was known to carry large sums of money, yet only a small amount was found in Clara's possession, hardly enough to justify murder. The knife wound was made by someone taller and stronger than Clara, according to Doc Peterson's private examination. Most telling, Fletcher had been in town for 3 days before his death, and during that time he was heard making threats against several people who owed him gambling debts. Clara Rose is a woman of education and refinement, despite her current circumstances. I have learned, through careful inquiry, that she was once a teacher in a small town in Kansas, and her only crime appears to be being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She fled to Redemption Bluff seeking a new start, not from guilt, but from grief. She lost her parents and her position all in the same month. I tell you this, not to manipulate your decision, but to ensure that you have all the facts. Whether you choose to act on this information is entirely up to you. I trust your judgment, as I have always trusted your heart, even when you refuse to trust it yourself. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of the man you have become and confident in the man you will yet be. Your loving uncle, Jonathan Crane. Thaddeus read the letter twice before looking up at Whitmore, who had been watching him with the patient expression of a man who had delivered difficult news many times over the years. He was quite convinced of her innocence, the lawyer said. Spent his own money hiring a private investigator from Denver. The man's report is in that envelope as well, if you care to review it. And you? Thaddeus asked. What do you think? Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the desk. I think your uncle was many things: stubborn, opinionated, sometimes too clever for his own good, but he was never wrong about people. If he believed Clara Rose was innocent, then I would stake my reputation on her innocence as well. Thaddeus rose from his chair and walked to the window that looked out on the main street. The town was beginning to stir with the morning's activity, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, horses being hitched to wagons, children running errands for their mothers. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of daily rhythm that made a man feel connected to something larger than himself. But beneath that peaceful surface, Thaddeus knew, lay currents of gossip, judgment, and fear. Clara Rose had become the town's monster, the dangerous woman locked safely away where she couldn't harm decent folks. Her trial had been swift and her conviction certain, not because of overwhelming evidence, but because the town needed someone to blame for the disruption Fletcher's death had caused. I'll need to speak with her, Thaddeus said finally. I thought you might, Whitmore replied, already reaching for his hat. Sheriff Murphy is expecting us. The walk to the jail took them through the heart of Redemption Bluff, past the general store where Mrs. Henderson stopped her, sweeping to stare at them with curious eyes, past the saloon, where even at this early hour, a few dedicated drinkers were already establishing their positions for the day. Word traveled fast in a small town, and by the time they reached the sheriff's office, Thaddeus could feel the weight of a dozen conversations that would begin with, "Did you see Thaddeus Crane heading toward the jail?" Sheriff Murphy was a good man who had taken the job because someone had to do it, not because he had any particular talent for law enforcement. He was approaching 60, with a soft belly and softer heart that made him more suited to breaking up saloon fights than investigating murders. When Thaddeus and Whitmore entered his office, Murphy looked up from his coffee with the expression of a man who had been dreading this conversation. "Morning, Thaddeus." "Edgar." Murphy's voice carried the weariness of a man who had slept poorly. "I suppose you're here about the Rose woman." "We'd like to speak with her," Thaddeus said, "privately, if possible." Murphy's weathered face creased with concern. "Now, Thaddeus, I hope you're not thinking of doing anything foolish. That woman is dangerous, and she's got a date with the hangman in 10 days. Best to let sleeping dogs lie." "I'm not here to cause trouble, Sheriff. I just want to hear her side of the story." "Her side?" Murphy's voice rose slightly. "Son, I've got a dead man and a woman caught red-handed with blood on her dress and his money in her pocket. What more story do you need?" Whitmore cleared his throat gently. "Sheriff, Mr. Crane has certain legal interests in this case that require him to conduct his own interview. I assure you, everything will be done properly and within the bounds of the law." Murphy looked between the two men, clearly uncomfortable, but unable to find a legal reason to refuse. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in talking, but I'll be right outside that door, and if she tries anything—" "She won't," Thaddeus said with more confidence than he felt. The jail consisted of 3 cells in the back of the building, separated from Murphy's office by a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. 2 of the cells stood empty, their doors hanging open to reveal narrow bunks and chamber pots. The 3rd cell was occupied. Clara Rose sat on the edge of her bunk, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight despite the circumstances. She was smaller than Thaddeus had expected. The stories had painted her as an Amazon, but there was something in her bearing that suggested strength rather than fragility. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her green eyes held a directness that was startling in its intensity. She was, without question, the most beautiful woman Thaddeus had ever seen. But more than that, she possessed a quality that went beyond mere beauty, a dignity that remained intact despite her circumstances, a sense of self that couldn't be diminished by iron bars or public condemnation. "Mr. Crane," she said, rising as he approached. Her voice was clear and well modulated, with the accent of education rather than the frontier. "I wondered when you might come to see me. Miss Rose." Thaddeus found himself uncertain how to begin. The woman before him bore no resemblance to the dangerous criminal the town had made her out to be. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." "There's nothing to forgive. I welcome the company." She gestured to the cell's single chair. "Please, sit, though I'm afraid I can't offer you coffee." Despite the grimness of the situation, Thaddeus found himself almost smiling at her gracious manner. "Thank you, but I prefer to stand." They studied each other in silence for a moment, each taking the measure of the other. Thaddeus saw intelligence in her eyes, and pain, but no guilt or deception. Clara saw a man who carried himself with authority, but approached her without the fear or disgust that characterized most of her visitors. "You're here about your uncle's investigation," she said finally. "He was a kind man, one of the few people who bothered to listen to my side of the story." "And what is your side of the story, Miss Rose?" Clara's hands tightened slightly in her lap, the only sign that the question affected her. "I didn't kill Benjamin Fletcher. I never even spoke to the man while he was alive. But I understand why no one believes me. The evidence against me is damning, and I have no way to prove my innocence. Where were you the night Fletcher was killed?" "In my room at the boarding house, asleep. I had retired early with a headache." Her voice remained steady, but Thaddeus could see the effort it cost her to remain composed. "I woke to screaming in the street. When I looked out my window, I saw people gathering around something in the alley. I dressed quickly and went to see what had happened." "And that's when you found Fletcher's body?" "No." Clara's denial was firm. "That's when someone struck me from behind. I remember falling, and then nothing until I woke up in this cell with Sheriff Murphy telling me I was under arrest for murder." Thaddeus absorbed this, comparing it to the official story he had heard. According to Murphy, Clara had been found unconscious beside Fletcher's body, her dress stained with his blood, his wallet in her possession. The sheriff had assumed she had been injured while struggling with her victim. "You have no memory of how Fletcher's blood came to be on your dress?" "None. I can only assume that whoever really killed him used my unconscious body to confuse the evidence." Clara's voice carried a bitter note. "It was quite effective. Why would someone want to frame you specifically?" Clara was quiet for so long that Thaddeus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I had been in town for less than a week. I knew no one, and had made no enemies that I was aware of. The only explanation I can think of is that I was simply convenient." Thaddeus studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. He had become skilled at reading people over the years. It was a necessary talent in business, but Clara Rose was either completely truthful or the most accomplished liar he had ever encountered. "Miss Rose," he said carefully, "I have a proposition for you." Clara's green eyes sharpened with suspicion. "A proposition?" Thaddeus moved closer to the cell bars, lowering his voice so that Sheriff Murphy couldn't overhear from the outer office. "I need a wife, Miss Rose, and you need your freedom." For a moment, Clara simply stared at him, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope before settling on wariness. "I'm not sure I understand. My uncle's will contains a marriage clause. I have 7 days to marry or lose half my inheritance to a development company that wants to turn ranching land into railroad routes." Thaddeus kept his voice matter-of-fact, treating the proposal like any other business arrangement. "You're facing execution for a crime you say you didn't commit. Marriage to me would make you my legal wife, and I have enough influence in this territory to ensure the charges against you are reconsidered." Clara's hand moved unconsciously to her throat. a gesture that spoke of too many nights lying awake thinking about the hangman's noose. And what would you expect from such a marriage? Nothing more than your presence as my legal wife, for as long as necessary to satisfy the terms of the inheritance. After that, we could arrange for an annulment or a quiet divorce, whichever you prefer. You would be free to go wherever you wish, with enough money to start over properly. You would marry a woman you believe to be a murderess? I believe you're innocent, Thaddeus said simply. My uncle was an excellent judge of character, and his investigation convinced him of your innocence. That's enough for me. Clara rose from her bunk and moved to the cell bars, close enough that Thaddeus could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. And if I'm not innocent, if I really did kill Benjamin Fletcher, then you'll have fooled us both, and I'll deserve whatever consequences follow. Thaddeus met her gaze steadily. But I don't think you killed him, Miss Rose. I think you're exactly what you appear to be, a woman who found herself in an impossible situation through no fault of her own. Why? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Why would you risk everything for someone you don't even know? Thaddeus considered the question carefully. The honest answer was complex, part practical need, part intuitive certainty about her innocence, part something deeper that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Because sometimes doing the right thing is its own reward, he said finally, and because I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Clara stepped back from the bars, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. From her pocket, she pulled out a small silver locket, turning it over in her hands as she thought. The locket was dented and tarnished, clearly old and well-loved. This belonged to my mother, she said, holding it up so he could see the delicate engraving on its surface. It's the only thing of value I have left in this world. When they arrested me, Sheriff Murphy let me keep it because he said even condemned prisoners deserved one small comfort. Thaddeus waited, sensing that she was working up to something important. Inside is a photograph of my parents on their wedding day. They were married for 32 years before the fever took them both last winter. Clara's voice grew soft with memory. They loved each other desperately, completely. It was the kind of love that poets write about and most people spend their whole lives hoping to find. She looked up at Thaddeus, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I swore I would never marry unless I could have what they had. A marriage based on anything less would be a betrayal of their memory. And now? Clara's laugh held no humor. Now I'm facing the hangman's noose for a crime I didn't commit, and a stranger is offering me a marriage of convenience to save both our futures. My parents would understand, I think. They were practical people who believed in survival. Is that a yes? It's a maybe. Clara sat back down on her bunk, still clutching the locket. I need to know more about you, Mr. Crane. If I'm going to bind my life to yours, even temporarily, I need to understand what kind of man you are. Thaddeus leaned against the stone wall, settling in for what he sensed would be a long conversation. What would you like to know? Everything. Start with why you're 35 and unmarried. In my experience, successful men your age are usually married with children. I was engaged once, Thaddeus said, surprised to find himself willing to share something he rarely discussed. Her name was Margaret Henley. We were to be married 5 years ago. What happened? She decided she preferred a banker from Denver to a rancher from the frontier. She sent me a letter 3 days before our wedding, explaining that she had fallen in love with someone who could offer her a more sophisticated life. The memory still stung, though time had dulled the sharp edge of betrayal. I haven't seriously courted anyone since. Clara studied his face as he spoke, and Thaddeus had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he intended to reveal. You were hurt. I was embarrassed, he corrected, and angry, but mostly I was relieved to learn her true nature before the wedding rather than after. And you've been alone since then? I've been focused on building my ranch. There's a difference. Thaddeus realized how defensive that sounded and tried to soften his tone. I suppose I convinced myself that business success was more important than personal happiness. And now, do you still believe that? Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "My uncle's death taught me that money means nothing if you have no one to share it with, but I'm not sure I'm capable of the kind of love you described between your parents." "Why not?" "Because I've spent too many years building walls around my heart. I'm not sure I remember how to tear them down." Clara nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Tell me about your ranch." The change of subject caught Thaddeus off guard, but he found himself describing the diamond bar with the enthusiasm that always crept into his voice when he talked about the land. He told her about the vast pastures, where cattle grazed under endless skies, about the river that ran clear and cold through the heart of the property, about the house he had built on a hill overlooking the valley, where he could see for miles in every direction. "It sounds beautiful," Clara said when he finished. "And lonely." "Yes," Thaddeus admitted. "It is." "I was a teacher before I came here," Clara said suddenly, "in a small town in Kansas called Cedar Falls. I taught children from ages 6 to 14 in a one-room schoolhouse." "Why did you leave?" Pain flickered across Clara's features. "My parents died within a week of each other last winter. The fever hit our town hard, and by the time it passed, we had lost nearly a third of our population. The town council decided they could no longer afford to pay a teacher's salary, so they closed the school. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Losing them was like losing my anchor to the world. They had been the center of my universe since childhood, and without them, I felt completely adrift." Clara's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I had a little money saved, enough to travel and start over somewhere new. Redemption Bluff seemed like a good place to disappear and rebuild my life. Instead, you found yourself accused of murder." "Yes, though in a strange way, I'm grateful for your uncle's interest in my case. No one else bothered to look beyond the surface evidence. Sheriff Murphy is a kind man, but he's not an investigator." Thaddeus pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. They had been talking for nearly an hour, and he could hear Murphy stirring restlessly in the outer office. "I need an answer, Miss Rose. The marriage would need to take place within the next few days to satisfy the terms of the will." Clara stood and moved back to the cell bars, extending her hand through them. Thaddeus took it, surprised by the calluses on her palm, the hands of someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Crane," she said formally, "with the understanding that this is a business arrangement designed to solve both our problems." "Understood." Thaddeus shook her hand, sealing their agreement. "I'll speak with Sheriff Murphy about arranging the ceremony." "There's one more thing," Clara said, not releasing his hand. "I want your promise that you'll continue investigating Benjamin Fletcher's murder. I know you believe I'm innocent, but I need proof of that innocence. I need my name cleared completely, not just my life saved. You have my word." Clara smiled then, the first genuine smile Thaddeus had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "Then I suppose we're to be married, Mr. Crane." As Thaddeus left the jail 20 minutes later, having made arrangements with a thoroughly bewildered Sheriff Murphy for a wedding ceremony to be held the following morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't have predicted even a week ago. The news of the impending marriage spread through Redemption Bluff like wildfire. By evening, it was the only topic of conversation in the saloon, the general store, and every parlor in town. Some folks expressed shock that Thaddeus Crane would marry a condemned murderess. Others speculated about his motives, with theories ranging from temporary insanity to a secret romantic obsession. But as Thaddeus sat alone in his ranch house that night, staring out at the moonlit pastures that had been his whole world for so many years, he found himself thinking less about the town's gossip and more about the woman he was about to marry. There had been something in Clara Rose's eyes that spoke to a part of him he had thought was dead, a spark of recognition that suggested they understood each other in ways that went beyond their mutual convenience. Tomorrow, he would marry a woman he barely knew to save them both. Whether that decision would prove to be salvation or disaster remained to be seen. The wedding ceremony took place at dawn in the jail cell. with Sheriff Murphy serving as reluctant witness and Judge Hawkins performing the abbreviated service with the speed of a man who wanted the whole affair behind him as quickly as possible. Clara wore the same simple blue dress she had been arrested in, now cleaned but still bearing faint stains that no amount of washing could completely remove. Thaddeus had dressed in his finest suit, a gesture of respect that wasn't lost on Clara despite the circumstances. "Do you, Thaddeus Crane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Judge Hawkins asked, his voice carrying the formal weight of legal proceedings. "I do," Thaddeus replied, looking directly into Clara's eyes as he spoke the words. "And do you, Clara Rose, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Clara said softly, her hand trembling slightly as Thaddeus slipped his uncle's simple gold wedding band onto her finger. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Hawkins closed his book with a snap. "You may kiss the bride, if you're so inclined." The moment stretched between them, awkward and charged with significance neither was ready to acknowledge. Finally, Thaddeus leaned forward and placed a chaste kiss on Clara's cheek, the touch so brief and light it might have been imagined. "Mrs. Crane," he said formally, stepping back. "Mr. Crane," she replied with equal formality, though something flickered in her green eyes that might have been amusement. Sheriff Murphy produced a blood-stained handkerchief from his desk drawer as the marriage party prepared to leave. "Almost forgot," he said, holding up the stained cloth. "This was found at the murder scene. Might mean something, might not. Figured you should have it, seeing as how you're so interested in this case." Thaddeus examined the handkerchief carefully. It was fine linen, far too expensive for someone like Fletcher to have owned. More importantly, the stains didn't match the pattern they should have if it had belonged to the victim. Where exactly was this found? "About 10 feet from Fletcher's body, tucked behind a rain barrel," Murphy said. "I always figured it belonged to whoever found him first, probably dropped it in the excitement." But as Thaddeus studied the bloodstains more closely, he realized they told a different story. The pattern suggested the handkerchief had been used to wipe clean a blade, the real murder weapon, not the knife found near Fletcher's body. Someone had made a mistake, and that mistake might be the key to proving Clara's innocence. The ride to the Crane Ranch passed in relative silence, with Clara seated beside Thaddeus on the wagon bench, both of them acutely aware that they were now legally bound to each other, despite being virtual strangers. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, and Clara drew in a sharp breath at the sight. The house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure built of honey-colored stone with wide porches that wrapped around 3 sides. It sat on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, surrounded by carefully tended gardens and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Beyond the house, cattle dotted the pastures like dark specks on a green canvas that stretched to the horizon. "It's beautiful," Clara said, and meant it. "Thank you," Thaddeus replied, though he sounded oddly uncertain. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." The ranch hands who had gathered to see their boss's new bride maintained respectful silence, but Clara could feel their curious stares as Thaddeus helped her down from the wagon. These were hard men who had worked cattle under the prairie sun for years, and she knew that earning their respect would be neither automatic nor easy. "This is my foreman, Joe Martinez," Thaddeus said, introducing a weathered man with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "Joe, this is my wife, Clara." "Ma'am," Joe said, touching his hat brim. His expression was carefully neutral, but Clara detected no hostility in his manner. "Welcome to the Diamond Bar." "Thank you, Mr. Martinez. I look forward to learning about ranch life." Something in her straightforward response seemed to please Joe, and Clara caught the slightest nod of approval before he turned back to Thaddeus. "Got that shipment of supplies in from town, boss. Everything you ordered, plus a few extra things Mrs. Rodriguez thought your lady might need." Mrs. Rodriguez turned out to be the ranch's cook and housekeeper, a plump woman with graying hair and warm brown eyes who bustled out of the house as the wagon approached. She took one look at Clara and immediately swept her into a motherly embrace. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment as naturally as breathing. "You look like you need feeding. Too skinny. And those clothes." She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Come, we fix this." Clara found herself whisked into the house before she could protest, leaving Thaddeus standing by the wagon with an expression that suggested he was already wondering what he had gotten himself into. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, with high ceilings, polished wood floors, and furniture that managed to be both practical and elegant. But it was also clearly the home of a bachelor, well-appointed but impersonal, lacking the small touches that made a house feel truly lived in. "Your husband, he is a good man, Mrs. Rodriguez said as she led Clara through the spacious rooms. "But he has forgotten how to live, I think. Too much time working, not enough time enjoying what he has built." Clara's assigned bedroom was on the second floor, with windows that looked out over the valley and a connecting door to what was obviously the master bedroom. The arrangement was both intimate and proper, allowing them privacy while maintaining the appearance of a normal married couple. "These were his mother's things," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, indicating a wardrobe full of women's clothing. "Mr. Thaddeus, he kept them all these years, said maybe someday they would be useful. She was about your size, I think." Clara ran her hand over a dress of deep green silk, imagining the woman who had worn it. What was she like? "Beautiful, like you, but sad, sometimes. She missed the city, I think. The ranch, it can be lonely for a woman used to society." Mrs. Rodriguez's voice grew gentle. "But you, I think you are stronger. You have survived much already." That evening, Clara joined Thaddeus for dinner in the large dining room, both of them struggling with the awkwardness of their situation. She had changed into one of his mother's dresses, the green silk that brought out her eyes, and Thaddeus found himself staring at her more than was probably appropriate. "The hands seem like good men," Clara said, attempting conversation. "They are. Most have been with me for years. Joe Martinez has been foreman since I took over the ranch." Thaddeus cut his steak with more precision than necessary. "They'll respect you because you're my wife, but earning their genuine acceptance will take time." "I understand. I'm not expecting special treatment." "Good, because ranch life is hard work. Even the boss's wife has responsibilities." Clara set down her fork and looked at him directly. "Mr. Crane, I want to be clear about something. I may have married you out of necessity, but I have no intention of being a burden. I was raised to work hard and contribute to any household I'm part of. If there are duties that need doing, I want to do my share." Something in her tone made Thaddeus look up from his plate. "Most ladies of your education would consider ranch work beneath them. Then they would be fools. Honest work is never beneath anyone, regardless of their education." Clara's voice carried a conviction that spoke of personal experience. "I taught school for 8 years, Mr. Crane. Do you know what teachers do besides teach?" "I suppose I never thought about it. We arrive before dawn to start fires and prepare lessons. We clean the schoolhouse, maintain the supplies, mediate disputes between students and their parents, and often provide the only medical care available when children are hurt or sick." Clara's eyes sparkled with something that might have been challenge. "I've birthed calves and tended sick animals at my parents' farm. I can preserve food, mend clothes, manage household accounts, and organize supply inventories. What exactly about ranch life do you think would be beyond my capabilities?" Thaddeus found himself almost smiling at her directness. "Point taken, Mrs. Crane. Good. Now, tell me about this handkerchief Sheriff Murphy gave you. What did you see in it that he missed?" The question caught Thaddeus off guard. He had been planning to investigate Fletcher's murder on his own, not wanting to involve Clara more than necessary, but her direct approach made him reconsider. "The bloodstains are wrong," he said, pulling the handkerchief from his vest pocket. "If this belonged to Fletcher or someone who tried to help him, the stains would be different. These marks suggest it was used to clean a blade." Clara studied the stained cloth carefully. So the real murderer used this to wipe the knife clean, then discarded it at the scene. That's what I think. Which means the killer made a mistake. Fine linen like this doesn't come cheap. Whoever owns it has money. Or had access to someone else's expensive handkerchief. Clara's mind was clearly working through the possibilities. Benjamin Fletcher was a gambler, wasn't he? He might have won it from someone in a card game. Thaddeus looked at her with new respect. That's an excellent point. If Fletcher had won this from someone recently, it would give us a potential motive for murder. It would also explain why the killer used it to clean the weapon, a moment of panic, grabbing the nearest thing to hand without thinking about the implications. They spent the rest of the dinner discussing the case, and Thaddeus found himself impressed by Clara's logical approach to the evidence. She asked intelligent questions and offered insights he hadn't considered. By the time Mrs. Rodriguez cleared the dishes, they had developed a plan for investigating Fletcher's activities during his time in Redemption Bluff. "I should warn you," Thaddeus said as they prepared to retire for the evening. "People in town are going to be watching our every move. This marriage has generated considerable gossip. Let them talk. We know the truth of our arrangement, and that's all that matters." Clara paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Thank you, Mr. Crane, for believing in my innocence and for giving me a chance at a new life." "Thaddeus," he said quietly, "if we're going to be married even temporarily, you should call me Thaddeus." "Thaddeus," she repeated, testing the name, "and you should call me Clara. Good night, Clara. Good night, Thaddeus." As Clara climbed the stairs to her room, Thaddeus remained in the parlor for a long time, staring into the fire and trying to understand what he had gotten himself into. He had married a woman to save her life and secure his inheritance, but already he was beginning to suspect that Clara Rose, Clara Crane now, was going to change his carefully ordered world in ways he couldn't predict. In her room, Clara stood at the window, looking out over the moonlit valley, still wearing his mother's green dress. The gold wedding band on her finger caught the light, a symbol of promises neither fully understood yet. She had gained her freedom, but at the cost of binding herself to a man who was essentially a stranger. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of proving her innocence and learning to live as husband and wife, even if their marriage was only temporary. But as Clara prepared for bed in her new home, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about this arrangement would turn out to be as simple as they both hoped. Clara's first week at the Diamond Bar passed in a blur of new routines and careful navigation of her unusual circumstances. She rose before dawn each morning, drawn by the quiet beauty of the sunrise over the valley and the peaceful rhythm of ranch life awakening around her. Mrs. Rodriguez had quickly discovered that Clara was not content to sit idle, and soon had her helping with everything from meal preparation to managing the household accounts. "You have good hands for this work," the older woman observed as Clara efficiently tallied the monthly supply orders. "And a good head for numbers. Mr. Thaddeus, he will be pleased." But Clara's most significant discovery came when she found herself drawn to the ranch's small library, a room lined with well-worn books that revealed more about Thaddeus than any conversation they had shared. Among volumes on cattle breeding and land management, she discovered poetry collections, classic novels, and philosophical works that spoke of a man with depths he kept carefully hidden. It was there that she found the diary, tucked between agricultural texts where it might easily be overlooked. The leather binding was worn soft with handling, and Clara's name was embossed in faded gold letters on the cover. For a moment, she was confused. Surely this couldn't be hers, until she opened it and saw her own handwriting on the first page. "Day 1 in Redemption Bluff," she had written 3 months ago. "I arrived this evening on the stage. Tired and dusty, but hopeful that this town might offer the fresh start I desperately need. The boarding house is clean and respectable, and Mrs. Patterson seems kind. Perhaps here I can finally begin to heal from all the losses I've endured." Clara sank into a chair as memories flooded back. She had indeed kept a diary during her first weeks in town, writing in it each evening as a way to process her grief and uncertainty. But she had thought it lost when she was arrested. Sheriff Murphy had certainly never returned it with her other belongings. She flipped through the pages, reading her own account of those first days in Redemption Bluff. Her handwriting chronicled her attempts to find work, her growing comfort with the town's routines, and her cautious optimism about the future. But it was the final entry that made her blood run cold. I am troubled by something I witnessed tonight. From my window at the boarding house, I saw two men arguing in the alley behind the hotel. One was Mr. Fletcher, the gambling man who has been staying there. The other I recognized as Mr. Samuel Wright from the Land Development Company. Their voices were raised, and I distinctly heard Mr. Wright say, "You'll keep your mouth shut about Denver, or you'll regret it." Mr. Fletcher laughed and said something about having insurance. Mr. Wright struck him then, and Mr. Fletcher fell against the hotel wall. I thought about going for help, but by the time I gathered my courage, both men had disappeared into the darkness. I pray this was nothing more than a business disagreement, but I fear I may have witnessed something more serious. Clara's hands trembled as she read her own words. Samuel Wright, she remembered him now, a smooth-talking man in expensive clothes who claimed to represent Eastern investors interested in purchasing ranch land. She had seen him around town during her first week, always impeccably dressed and speaking in the cultured tones of education and money. But more importantly, she had witnessed Wright threatening Fletcher the night before the murder, and someone had taken her diary, the only record of what she had seen. Finding something interesting? Clara spun around to find Thaddeus standing in the library doorway, his expression curious but not alarmed. She held up the diary with shaking hands. "This is mine," she said. "I kept a diary when I first came to town. I thought it was lost when I was arrested, but here it is, in your library." Thaddeus moved closer, studying the leather-bound book. "Where did you find it?" "Tucked between these agriculture books, as if someone wanted to hide it but not destroy it." Clara opened to the final entry and handed the diary to Thaddeus. "Read this." She watched his face as he read her account of Wright threatening Fletcher, saw his expression grow increasingly grim as the implications became clear. "This changes everything," he said finally. "If Wright threatened Fletcher the night before the murder, then he had motive to kill him. And if someone took my diary from the boarding house and hid it here, they were trying to suppress evidence that could have cleared my name." Clara's voice grew stronger as the pieces fell into place. "But why hide it in your library? Why not destroy it entirely?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the possibilities. "Because whoever hid it wanted to keep it as leverage, perhaps, or insurance of their own, or because they knew you would eventually find it and understand its significance." "You think someone wanted me to discover the truth about Fletcher's murder?" Clara considered this carefully. "Your uncle was investigating my case before he died. What if someone knew he was getting close to the truth? What if his death wasn't as natural as it appeared?" The thought sent a chill through both of them. Jonathan Crane had died peacefully in his sleep, according to Doc Peterson's assessment. But now, Clara's suggestion raised troubling questions about the timing of his death. "We need to speak with Samuel Wright," Thaddeus said, "but carefully. If he killed Fletcher and had something to do with my uncle's death, approaching him directly could be dangerous. Where is he now?" "Still in town, as far as I know. The Territorial Land Development Company has been trying to buy out several ranches in the area. They've made offers on my land 3 times in the past year." Clara closed the diary and tucked it carefully into her skirt pocket. "Then we know where to find him." That afternoon, they rode into Redemption Bluff together, ostensibly to conduct business at the bank, but actually to gather information about Wright's activities. The town's reaction to seeing them together was predictable. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they passed, and Clara could feel the weight of curious and disapproving stares. At the bank, they learned that Wright had been conducting significant financial transactions over the past several months, including the purchase of 3 properties from ranchers who had fallen behind on their mortgages. The bank president, a cautious man named Henry Morrison, was reluctant to share details, but confirmed that Wright represented substantial Eastern interests. "Funny thing, though," Morrison said as he walked them to the door. "Wright's been asking a lot of questions about your ranch, Thaddeus. Specifically about whether you had any plans to marry or start a family. Seemed mighty interested in the terms of your uncle's will." Clara and Thaddeus exchanged glances. If Wright knew about the marriage clause in Jonathan's will, it suggested a level of inside knowledge that was deeply troubling. Their next stop was the hotel where Fletcher had been staying. The desk clerk, a nervous young man named Peter, remembered Wright well. "Oh yes, he's been staying here off and on for months," Peter said. "Always pays in cash, always very polite, but he asks a lot of questions about the other guests, if you know what I mean." "What kind of questions?" Clara asked. "About their business, their finances, their personal situations. Mr. Fletcher, for instance. Mr. Wright seemed real interested in Fletcher's gambling activities. Asked me several times about who Fletcher played cards with and whether he won or lost." This information painted a picture of Wright as someone who made it his business to know everyone else's secrets. If Fletcher had stumbled onto something that could damage Wright's plans, it would certainly provide motive for murder. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Clara noticed a familiar figure emerging from the saloon across the street. Samuel Wright looked exactly as she remembered, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of smooth confidence that marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way. "There he is," she whispered to Thaddeus. Wright spotted them almost immediately, his face breaking into the practiced smile of a man who made his living being charming. He crossed the street with purposeful strides, clearly intending to approach them. "Mr. Crane," Wright called out as he drew near, "and this must be your lovely bride. My congratulations on your recent marriage." "Mr. Wright," Thaddeus replied coolly. "Thank you." Wright turned to Clara with an expression that might have been sympathy if she hadn't known better. "Mrs. Crane, I must say how pleased I am to see you looking so well. Your recent troubles must have been quite an ordeal." "Indeed they were," Clara replied carefully, "though I'm fortunate to have married such a kind and generous man. Quite fortunate indeed, and how serendipitous that Mr. Crane should find a wife just in time to satisfy the terms of his uncle's will." Wright's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "It's amazing how things work out for the best, don't you think?" The comment was clearly meant to unsettle them, and it succeeded. Wright knew far too much about their circumstances for comfort. "Yes," Thaddeus said evenly. "Amazing indeed. I trust your business ventures in town are proceeding well." "Very well, thank you. In fact, I was just thinking that your recent change in circumstances might make you more amenable to discussing my company's interest in your property. A married man has different priorities than a bachelor, after all." "My priorities haven't changed, Mr. Wright. The Diamond Bar is not for sale." Wright's smile faltered slightly. "Of course not. Well, perhaps in time you'll reconsider. After all, circumstances have a way of changing when we least expect them." He tipped his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Crane, it was a pleasure to finally meet you. I do hope your new life brings you all the happiness you deserve." As Wright walked away, Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. The man's words had carried an unmistakable threat, carefully disguised as polite conversation. "He knows," she said quietly to Thaddeus. "He knows about the diary, about what I saw that night, and he's warning us to stay away from the truth. Then we must be getting close to something he doesn't want discovered." Thaddeus helped Clara into their wagon, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "The question is, how far is he willing to go to protect his secrets?" As they drove back to the ranch, both were lost in thought about the dangerous game they had inadvertently entered. Clara's diary had provided them with crucial evidence, but it had also revealed that their enemy was more dangerous and better informed than they had realized. That night, Clara sat at her bedroom window, writing in her diary once again, this time documenting everything they had learned about Wright and his connection to Fletcher's murder. If something happened to her and Thaddeus, she wanted there to be a record of the truth they had uncovered. But as she wrote, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Wright's network of information gathering extended even to the supposedly safe confines of the Diamond Bar Ranch. The nightmare always began the same way. Clara was walking down the main street of Cedar Falls, Kansas, in the spring sunshine, on her way to the schoolhouse where 23 children waited for their lessons. But when she reached for the schoolhouse door, her hand came away covered in blood. She turned to run, but the street had become an alley in Redemption Bluff, and Benjamin Fletcher's body lay crumpled against the hotel wall, his eyes staring accusingly at her. "You did this," he always said in the dream. "You brought death to everyone you touch." Clara woke with a gasp, her nightgown soaked with perspiration despite the cool night air. These dreams had plagued her since her arrest, but they seemed to be growing more frequent and vivid since her marriage to Thaddeus. Perhaps it was the guilt of involving an innocent man in her troubles, or perhaps it was the growing certainty that Samuel Wright would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. A soft knock at her bedroom door interrupted her troubled thoughts. "Clara, are you all right?" She wrapped a robe around herself and opened the door to find Thaddeus standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour. His hair was disheveled and his eyes were concerned. "I heard you cry out," he said. "Another nightmare." Clara nodded, suddenly embarrassed by her vulnerability. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you. They're getting worse, I'm afraid." "You have nothing to apologize for. After what you've been through, nightmares are hardly surprising." Thaddeus hesitated, then added, "Would you like some coffee?" "Mrs. Rodriguez is already up preparing breakfast, and I was going to check on the cattle in the north pasture." "I'd like that," Clara said gratefully. "Give me a moment to dress." 20 minutes later, they sat on the kitchen porch watching the sun rise over the valley, sharing coffee and the comfortable silence that had begun to develop between them. Clara wore a practical riding dress borrowed from his mother's wardrobe, and her auburn hair was braided simply down her back. In the golden morning light, Thaddeus thought she looked more beautiful than any woman had a right to look after a sleepless night. "Tell me about your dreams," he said gently. Clara was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They're about death. About everyone I've ever cared about dying because of something I did or failed to do. My parents, the children I taught, even you, all of them lying dead while I stand helpless and covered in blood. Clara, I know they're not rational," she continued quickly. "I know that dreams don't predict the future, but sometimes I wonder if there's some truth in them. Maybe I am cursed to bring tragedy to everyone around me." Thaddeus set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Do you know what I think about when I look at you?" Clara shook her head. "I think about courage. I think about a woman who faced the gallows with dignity, who married a stranger to save both their futures, who's willing to risk her safety to uncover the truth about a murder." Thaddeus's voice grew stronger as he continued. "You didn't bring death to your parents or tragedy to your town. Fever and economic hardship did that. You didn't kill Benjamin Fletcher. Someone else did that, and they tried to destroy your life to cover their tracks. But if I hadn't come to Redemption Bluff, then Fletcher would still be dead, and the real killer would have found some other way to avoid justice. Your presence here didn't cause these events, Clara. If anything, it may be the key to solving them." Clara looked at him with eyes that held unshed tears. "How can you be so certain?" "Because I've gotten to know you over these past weeks. I've seen how you treat Mrs. Rodriguez with kindness, how the ranch hands have begun to respect you, how you throw yourself into every task with dedication and skill." Thaddeus reached over and took her hand. "You're not a harbinger of death, Clara. You're a woman of strength and compassion who's been dealt some terrible cards." The warmth of his hand around hers sent an unexpected jolt through Clara. For the first time since their marriage, she was acutely aware of Thaddeus, not just as her legal husband, but as a man, an attractive, kind, complex man, who was looking at her with an expression that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me when I sometimes struggle to believe in myself." "Always," he replied, and Clara suspected he meant more than just his faith in her innocence. The intimate moment was interrupted by the arrival of Joe Martinez, who rode up to the porch with the rapid pace that indicated urgent news. "Boss," Joe called out as he dismounted, "we got trouble in the north pasture. Someone cut the fence during the night, and about 50 head of cattle are missing." Thaddeus was on his feet immediately, his expression shifting from gentle husband to ranch owner in an instant. "Any sign of who did it?" "Tracks suggest at least 3 men on horseback, maybe 4. They drove the cattle west toward the territorial boundary." Joe's weathered face was grim. "This wasn't random rustling, boss. They knew exactly which section of fence to cut and which cattle to take. Someone's been watching us." Clara felt a chill of recognition. "Right," she said quietly. Both men looked at her, and she continued. "Yesterday, he mentioned that circumstances have a way of changing unexpectedly. This feels like the beginning of a campaign to pressure you into selling." Thaddeus's jaw tightened with anger. "Joe, get 6 men together and prepare to track those cattle. I want them back, and I want to know who took them." "Already done, boss. We're ready to ride as soon as you are." "I'm coming with you," Clara said, standing up with determination. "Absolutely not," Thaddeus replied immediately. "This could be dangerous, and I'm not going to sit here helplessly while Wright escalates his campaign against us." Clara's voice carried the same steel that had helped her survive 3 months in jail. "I can ride as well as any man. I can shoot if necessary, and I'm not afraid of danger." "Clara, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. Wright is targeting both of us, not just you. This is my fight as much as yours." She fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. "Besides, you'll need someone watching your back, and I'm the only person you can completely trust." Joe Martinez cleared his throat diplomatically. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Mrs. Crane has a point. If this is Wright's doing, then you're both targets. Might be safer to stick together." Thaddeus looked between his wife and his foreman, recognizing the futility of arguing with 2 people who had already made up their minds. "Fine, but you stay close to me, and if shooting starts, you get behind cover immediately." "Agreed," Clara said, though her tone suggested she would make her own decisions when the time came. An hour later, 7 riders left the Diamond Bar Ranch, following the trail of the stolen cattle. Clara rode beside Thaddeus on a spirited mare named Stella, her divided riding skirt practical and her father's old Colt revolver holstered at her hip. She had surprised Thaddeus with her skill in the saddle, sitting her horse with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up around animals. The trail led them across increasingly rough terrain, through gullies and over rocky hills that seemed designed to slow pursuit. Whoever had taken the cattle knew the country well and was making every effort to avoid detection. "There," Joe said, pointing to a distant ridge where dust was visible against the morning sky. "They're pushing the cattle hard, trying to reach the territorial boundary before we can catch up." "How far to the boundary?" Clara asked. "About 5 miles, Thaddeus replied grimly. "Once they cross over, they'll be outside our jurisdiction, and getting the cattle back will be much more difficult." They pushed their horses harder, racing against time and the growing heat of the day. As they crested a particularly steep hill, the stolen cattle came into view, a dark mass moving across the valley below, driven by 4 mounted men who were clearly trying to reach the safety of territorial boundary. "There's something else," Joe said, pointing to another group of riders approaching from the east. "Company coming." Clara shaded her eyes against the sun and studied the approaching horsemen. "That's right," she said with certainty. "And he's brought help." Indeed, Samuel Wright was riding toward them with at least 8 men, all armed and moving with military precision. This was no longer about stolen cattle. It was a confrontation that could easily turn deadly. "We're outnumbered," one of the ranch hands said nervously. "Maybe in numbers." Thaddeus replied, his voice calm despite the danger. "But we're fighting for what's ours, and they're fighting for money. There's a difference." As the two groups approached each other across the valley floor, Clara felt her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was the moment she had been preparing for since the day she was arrested, the chance to face the man who had destroyed her life and fight back. But as they drew closer to Wright's group, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of Wright's men was wearing a shirt with distinctive bone buttons, buttons that exactly matched one she had seen in Benjamin Fletcher's hotel room the night before his murder. "Thaddeus," she said urgently, "the man on the sorrel horse, third from the left. He was in the hotel the night Fletcher died. I saw him leaving Fletcher's room." The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together, but Clara realized they were riding into a trap with odds that were heavily stacked against them. Wright hadn't just stolen their cattle, he had lured them into open country, where he could eliminate the two people who posed the greatest threat to his plans. As the gap between the two groups narrowed, Clara checked the position of her revolver and prepared herself for what might be the fight of their lives. The two groups of riders faced each other across 50 yards of dusty ground, hands resting casually on gun butts while maintaining the pretense of civilized conversation. Samuel Wright sat his horse with the confident bearing of a man who held all the advantages, his expensive suit somehow remaining pristine despite the hard ride. "Mr. Crane," Wright called out in a voice that carried across the distance between them, "what a pleasant surprise to encounter you so far from your ranch. Out for a morning ride with your lovely wife?" "We're tracking stolen cattle, Wright. 50 head that were taken from my north pasture last night." Thaddeus's voice was steady, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Wright made a show of looking around at the terrain with innocent confusion. "Stolen cattle? How terrible! I do hope you find them." He paused, letting his gaze settle on Clara, with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Though I must say, Mrs. Crane, it seems rather dangerous for a lady to be so far from home. These hills can be treacherous, especially for those unfamiliar with the territory." "I'm quite familiar with danger, Mr. Wright," Clara replied coolly, "and with men who hide their threats behind false courtesy." Wright's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. I'm simply concerned for your safety. After all, you've already had one unfortunate encounter with violence in Redemption Bluff." The casual mention of Fletcher's murder sent a ripple of tension through both groups of riders. Clara noticed that several of Wright's men had subtly adjusted their positions, creating clear lines of fire while maintaining the appearance of relaxed conversation. "Speaking of that unfortunate encounter," Clara said, raising her voice so all could hear, "I couldn't help but notice one of your associates, the gentleman on the sorrel horse, with the distinctive bone buttons on his shirt. The man in question, a lean, hard-faced individual with cold eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Clara saw Wright's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Those buttons are quite unusual," Clara continued. "I remember seeing them on a shirt in Benjamin Fletcher's hotel room the night he was killed. Strange how small details stick in one's memory." Wright's pretense of friendliness evaporated entirely. "Mrs. Crane, I think grief and trauma may have affected your memory. It would be unfortunate if you began spreading wild accusations based on confused recollections." "My memory is quite clear, actually. It's becoming clearer every day." Clara's hand moved casually to rest near her revolver. "Just as clear as my recollection of the conversation I witnessed between you and Fletcher the night before his death." "That's enough," Wright snapped, his mask finally slipping completely. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Crane. Both of you are." Thaddeus moved his horse slightly forward, positioning himself between Clara and Wright's group. "The only dangerous game here is the one you've been playing since you arrived in Redemption Bluff. Buying up land through intimidation and fraud, murdering anyone who threatens to expose you." Wright laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Murder? What a dramatic accusation." Though I suppose it's natural for a man to believe his wife's stories, even when those stories come from a condemned murderess. She's not a murderess, Thaddeus said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. She's an innocent woman you framed to cover your own crimes. Can you prove that? Wright's confidence was returning as he realized they had no witnesses beyond their small group. Can you prove any of your wild theories? Clara reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a small silver object, holding it up so it caught the sunlight. Actually, we can. This is Benjamin Fletcher's pocket watch, the one that was supposedly stolen the night he was killed. Wright's face went pale as he stared at the watch. Funny thing about this watch, Clara continued, it wasn't stolen at all. It was dropped in your hotel room 3 nights ago when Sheriff Murphy conducted his search. The sheriff gave it to my husband as evidence, never realizing its significance. It was a calculated bluff. Clara had found the watch in one of Wright's coat pockets during their visit to town, but she was gambling that Wright wouldn't remember exactly when and where he had lost it. You see, Clara said, Fletcher didn't just gamble with cards. He also had a talent for picking pockets when his luck at the tables ran poor. He lifted this watch from you during a card game, didn't he? And when you realized what he had taken, you also realized what else he might have discovered. Wright's composure was cracking visibly. You can't prove. The watch is engraved, Clara interrupted, still holding it aloft, with your initials and a rather interesting inscription about a business partnership in Denver. I'm sure the territorial marshal would be very interested in learning more about that partnership, especially given Fletcher's comment about having insurance. The man with the bone buttons suddenly spurred his horse forward, reaching for his gun. Boss, we need to end this now. Everything happened at once. The man's movement triggered a chain reaction as both groups of riders went for their weapons. Clara saw Thaddeus draw his Colt with practiced speed, while shouting for her to take cover behind a large boulder near the base of the hill. Gunshots rang out across the valley as Clara dove from her horse and scrambled behind the rocky shelter. She could hear Thaddeus and his men returning fire, their shots disciplined and accurate compared to the wild shooting from Wright's group. "Clara," Thaddeus called out during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back, checking her own revolver to make sure it was loaded. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see that Wright's men had taken cover behind a low ridge about 30 yards away. The stolen cattle had scattered during the opening volleys, making the entire confrontation seem even more surreal. "Right," Thaddeus shouted. "This ends now. We have enough evidence to see you hanged, and killing us won't change that." "I don't think so," Wright's voice came from behind the ridge. "Dead witnesses tell no tales, and accidents happen all the time on the frontier." More shots rang out, and Clara heard one of the Diamond Bar men cry out in pain. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she realized that Thaddeus and his men were pinned down with limited ammunition against a larger, better-positioned force. But Clara had noticed something. Wright's men hadn't a narrow gully that ran along the eastern edge of their position, hidden from view by scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. If she could work her way around their flank undetected, she might be able to create enough confusion to give Thaddeus and his men the advantage they needed. Moving as quietly as possible, Clara slipped away from her boulder and began working her way through the gully. The sound of gunfire covered any noise she might have made, and within minutes she had reached a position behind and slightly above Wright's group. From her new vantage point, she could see the entire battlefield clearly. Wright himself was crouched behind a large rock, directing his men's fire while staying safely out of range. The man with the bone buttons, Fletcher's real killer, she was now certain, was positioned at the southern end of their line, his rifle trained on the area where Thaddeus was taking cover. Clara took careful aim with her revolver, knowing she would only get one chance. She had learned to shoot on her father's farm, but this was the first time she had ever aimed a weapon at another human being. "Samuel Wright," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "This is for Benjamin Fletcher." Wright spun around in shock as he realized she was behind him, but Clara was already squeezing the trigger. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. The sudden appearance of gunfire from their rear sent Wright's men into confusion, and several of them broke cover to see what was happening. That moment of confusion was all Thaddeus and his men needed. They pressed their attack, and within minutes the fight was over. 3 of Wright's men were down, 2 were fleeing on horseback, and the rest had thrown down their weapons in surrender. Clara emerged from her hiding place to find Thaddeus limping toward her, blood seeping through his shirt sleeve, but his eyes bright with relief. "Are you hurt?" she asked, reaching out to examine his wound. "Just a graze, nothing serious." His hands were shaking slightly as he holstered his gun. "That was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. You could have been killed." "So could you, and I wasn't about to let that happen." Clara looked over at Wright, who was sitting on the ground clutching his wounded shoulder while Joe Martinez kept him covered. "Is it over?" "Not quite," Thaddeus said grimly. "We still need to get them back to town and make sure the territorial marshal understands exactly what's been happening here." The man with the bone buttons, who turned out to be named Jake Morrison, proved surprisingly willing to talk once he realized Wright could no longer protect him. During the long ride back to Redemption Bluff, with Wright and Morrison both under guard, Morrison confessed to killing Benjamin Fletcher on Wright's orders. "Fletcher had figured out Wright's whole scheme," Morrison explained, his voice flat with resignation. "Wright's been buying up ranch land using forged documents and intimidated sellers. Fletcher had gambling debts all over the territory, and he'd learned to supplement his income by gathering information he could sell. He'd discovered Wright's connection to fraudulent land deals in Denver and was threatening to expose him unless Wright paid him off. So Wright ordered you to kill him?" Wright said it had to look like robbery, but the woman, Mrs. Crane, she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Wright figured framing her for the murder would solve 2 problems at once: get rid of Fletcher and provide a convenient scapegoat. Clara felt a cold satisfaction, hearing her innocence confirmed, but it was tempered by anger at how close Wright had come to succeeding. "What about my diary? How did it end up in Thaddeus's library?" Morrison looked confused. "Diary? I don't know nothing about any diary." Wright, despite his wound and obvious defeat, maintained his defiant silence. But Clara suspected she knew who had hidden her diary, someone who had wanted the truth to eventually come out but couldn't risk exposing it directly. As the lights of Redemption Bluff came into view, Clara realized that the nightmare that had begun 3 months ago was finally ending. Wright would face trial for Fletcher's murder and his fraudulent land schemes. Morrison would likely hang for his role in the killing, and she would finally have the complete vindication she had dreamed of during those long nights in jail. But more than that, she realized as she rode beside Thaddeus through the gathering dusk, she had found something she hadn't expected when she accepted his marriage proposal. She had found a partner, a man willing to risk his life to protect her and fight for justice alongside her. "Thank you," she said quietly as they approached the outskirts of town. "For what?" Thaddeus asked. "For believing in me, for saving my life, for being the kind of man who would marry a stranger to give her a second chance." Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you. When this is all over, when you're completely cleared and free to make your own choices, yes? I hope you'll consider staying, not because of our arrangement, but because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Clara felt her heart racing. "Because?" "Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a business arrangement for me. You've become more than just my wife in name. Clara, you've become someone I can't imagine living without." As they rode into town to deliver Wright and Morrison to justice, Clara realized that her new life was just beginning, and it was going to be more wonderful than she had ever dared to hope. The telegraph message arrived at the Diamond Bar Ranch 3 days after Wright and Morrison were locked up in the Redemption Bluff jail. Mrs. Rodriguez brought it to Thaddeus as he and Clara were reviewing the recovered cattle inventory in his study, her weathered face creased with concern. "This came from Denver, senor," she said, handing him the yellow paper. "The telegraph operator said it was marked urgent." Thaddeus read the message twice before his face went pale. Without a word, he handed it to Clara, who read the carefully printed words with growing alarm. "Stop. Investigation immediately. Stop Jonathan Crane murdered. Stop your marriage. Illegal. Stop will forged. Stop Territorial Land Company has legal ownership of Diamond Bar. Stop. Leave immediately or face consequences. Stop." "This doesn't make sense," Clara said, studying the message. "If Uncle Jonathan was murdered, why is this person warning us instead of the authorities? And how could our marriage be illegal?" Thaddeus was already moving toward his desk, pulling out the leather portfolio that contained his uncle's will. "There's only one way to find out." He spread the documents carefully on the desk surface, studying them with the methodical attention of a man whose entire future might depend on what he discovered. Clara joined him, and together they examined every page of the will with minute care. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The language was typical legal terminology, the signatures appeared genuine, and the witness attestations were properly notarized. But then Clara noticed something odd about the paper itself. "Thaddeus, look at this page compared to the others. The color is slightly different, and the texture doesn't match." Indeed, the page containing the marriage clause appeared to be made of different paper stock than the rest of the document. When held up to the lamplight, the watermark was also different, a detail that would be easy to miss in casual inspection, but glaring once noticed. "The marriage clause was added after the original will was written," Thaddeus said grimly. "Someone inserted a forged page into Uncle Jonathan's will. But who? And why?" Before Thaddeus could answer, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch house at speed. Through the window, Clara could see at least a dozen riders, all wearing the badges of territorial marshals and federal agents. "Stay behind me," Thaddeus said, moving toward his gun cabinet. "Something tells me this isn't a social call." The lead rider was a tall, stern-faced man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He dismounted and approached the porch with official documents in his hand. "Mr. Thaddeus Crane?" he called out. "That's right," Thaddeus replied from the doorway, Clara standing beside him. "I'm Marshal William Hayes, United States Marshal Service. I have here a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States government and illegal occupation of federal land." Clara felt the world spinning around her. "Federal land? That's impossible. This ranch has been in the Crane family for over 20 years. Marshal Hayes consulted his documents. "According to our investigation, the original land grant to Jonathan Crane was obtained through fraudulent means. The Territorial Land Development Company has provided evidence that Mr. Jonathan Crane conspired with corrupt territorial officials to secure land grants for property that was already designated for railroad development." "That's a lie," Thaddeus said flatly. "My uncle was the most honest man I ever knew. He would never have participated in any kind of fraud." "Perhaps not knowingly," Hayes replied with what might have been sympathy, "but our investigation has uncovered evidence that suggests Mr. Crane was the victim of an elaborate scheme designed to make him appear complicit in land fraud. The real conspirators needed a respectable frontman, and they used him for that purpose." Clara's mind was racing as the implications became clear. Someone set up Uncle Jonathan from the very beginning. The fraudulent land grants, the forged will with the marriage clause, it was all designed to eventually transfer ownership of this ranch to the Territorial Land Development Company. "That appears to be the case, ma'am," Hayes confirmed. "The marriage clause in the will was particularly clever. If Mr. Crane had remained unmarried, the company would have claimed half the ranch immediately. But by marrying, he triggered additional investigation into the legitimacy of the original land grants, which revealed the entire fraudulent scheme." Thaddeus stepped forward, his hands held away from his weapons. "Marshal, my wife and I will cooperate fully with your investigation. But I need to know, what evidence do you have regarding my uncle's death?" Hayes hesitated, then pulled out a second set of documents. According to the Denver coroner's re-examination of the body, Jonathan Crane died from arsenic poisoning administered over a period of several weeks. The initial examination missed it because the symptoms mimicked natural illness in an elderly man. Clara felt sick. The kind, gentle man who had believed in her innocence had been slowly murdered while trying to help her. Who did it? Who poisoned him? We believe it was someone with regular access to his food or drink, someone he trusted completely. Hayes looked directly at Clara. Mrs. Crane, I'm afraid you're also under arrest. Evidence suggests that you were working with Samuel Wright from the beginning, and that your marriage to Mr. Crane was part of the conspiracy to defraud the government. What? Clara stepped back in shock. That's insane. Wright framed me for murder. He tried to have me executed. According to our investigation, that was all theater designed to establish your credibility as Wright's victim. The convenient discovery of your diary, your marriage to Mr. Crane just in time to satisfy the will's requirements, your presence during the confrontation where Wright was conveniently wounded but not killed. It all points to an elaborate performance. Thaddeus moved protectively in front of Clara. Marshal, you're making a terrible mistake. My wife is innocent of any wrongdoing. If you're looking for conspirators, you should be investigating the people who forged my uncle's will. We are investigating, Mr. Crane. And all the evidence points to a conspiracy between your wife, Samuel Wright, and someone inside the territorial government who had access to official documents and land records. Clara's legs felt weak as the full scope of the trap became clear. Someone had orchestrated an incredibly complex scheme designed to not only steal the Diamond Bar Ranch, but also to frame her and Thaddeus for the crime. Wright's capture hadn't been the end of the conspiracy. It had been another step in a much larger plan. There's more, Hayes continued. We found this in Wright's hotel room after his arrest. He produced Clara's diary, but not the version they had discovered in Thaddeus's library. This copy contained additional entries in Clara's handwriting, entries that detailed her supposed cooperation with Wright and her plans to seduce and marry Thaddeus as part of the land fraud scheme. Clara stared at the diary in horror. The handwriting was perfect, the ink was aged to match her other entries, and even the paper looked authentic. Someone had created a forgery so skillful that even she might have questioned her own memory if she hadn't known the truth. I never wrote those entries, she said desperately. Someone forged them, just like they forged Uncle Jonathan's will. Perhaps, Hayes said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe her. That will be for a federal court to decide. Both of you are under arrest and will be transported to Denver for trial. As the marshals moved forward with shackles, Clara looked at Thaddeus and saw her own desperation reflected in his eyes. They had thought they were fighting Samuel Wright, but Wright had apparently been just another pawn in a much larger game. Someone with significant resources and government connections had been manipulating events from the very beginning, using Wright, Clara, Thaddeus, and even Uncle Jonathan as pieces on a chessboard. The real enemy was still out there, still hidden behind layers of deception and forged documents. And unless Clara and Thaddeus could figure out who was really behind the conspiracy, they would both hang for crimes they didn't commit, while the true villains claimed their prize. As the shackles clicked shut around her wrists, Clara realized that their fight for justice was just beginning. But this time, they would be fighting from inside a federal prison, with the full weight of the United States government arrayed against them. I believe you, Thaddeus said quietly as they were led toward the waiting prison wagon. Whatever happens, I believe you. And I believe you, Clara replied. We'll find a way out of this, together. But as the Diamond Bar Ranch disappeared behind them, Clara couldn't help but wonder if their faith in each other would be enough to overcome a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The real enemy had played a masterful game so far, staying hidden while others took the blame for their crimes. Now Clara and Thaddeus would have to find a way to expose the truth before their own execution made the conspiracy's victory complete. The Denver Federal Prison was a fortress of gray stone and iron bars that seemed designed to crush hope as efficiently as it contained prisoners. Clara and Thaddeus had been separated immediately upon arrival, placed in cells on opposite sides of the facility where they could neither see nor speak to each other. For 3 weeks, Clara's only contact with the outside world came through her court-appointed attorney, a young man named David Preston, who seemed more interested in negotiating a plea bargain than mounting a defense. "Mrs. Crane," Preston said during their latest meeting in the prison's stark interview room, "I must again urge you to consider the prosecution's offer. If you testify against your husband and provide details about the conspiracy, they're prepared to recommend a sentence of 20 years instead of hanging." Clara looked at the earnest young lawyer with something approaching pity. "Mr. Preston, for the last time, there was no conspiracy. My husband and I are innocent of all charges." "The evidence suggests otherwise. The forged diary entries, the convenient timing of your marriage, the complex financial transactions traced to accounts bearing your signatures, all forgeries." Clara interrupted. "Someone with considerable resources and government connections has orchestrated this entire affair to steal the Diamond Bar Ranch and destroy anyone who might expose their crimes." Preston sighed and closed his leather portfolio. "Mrs. Crane, even if that were true, we have no evidence to support such a theory. The prosecution has documents, witnesses, and a clear narrative that explains all the events. What do we have? A claim of innocence and speculation about some mysterious conspiracy." Clara leaned forward across the table. "What we have is the truth, Mr. Preston, and sometimes the truth is enough." But even as she spoke the words, Clara felt doubt creeping into her heart. The evidence against them was overwhelming and professionally constructed. Someone had spent months, perhaps years, building an unshakable case that painted her and Thaddeus as the masterminds behind a complex fraud scheme. After Preston left, Clara was returned to her cell, where she spent the long hours trying to piece together the puzzle of their persecution. The real conspiracy was brilliant in its complexity. Every piece of evidence had been carefully crafted to support the narrative of their guilt, while simultaneously destroying any proof of their innocence. But on the 4th week of her imprisonment, everything changed with the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Clara was summoned to the interview room to find a distinguished older woman waiting for her, elegantly dressed despite the prison's harsh surroundings. "Mrs. Crane," the woman said, rising as Clara entered, "my name is Margaret Henley Morrison. I believe you know my former fiancé, Thaddeus Crane." Clara stared in shock at the woman who had abandoned Thaddeus 5 years ago. Margaret was still beautiful, but there were lines around her eyes that spoke of secrets and regrets. "What are you doing here?" Clara asked warily. "I'm here to help you and Thaddeus, though I suspect you have every right to refuse my assistance." Margaret's voice carried genuine remorse. "I've come to tell you about my husband, Henry Morrison, and his connection to the Territorial Land Development Company." Clara sat down heavily as the implications became clear. Margaret's husband was the bank president they had spoken with weeks ago, the man who had seemed so helpful in providing information about Wright's financial activities. "Henry has been the inside man from the beginning," Margaret continued. "He's the one who forged the land grants, created the false bank records, and coordinated with corrupt territorial officials to make the whole scheme appear legitimate." "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Because I've discovered that Henry plans to kill both you and Thaddeus before the trial. He can't risk either of you testifying because you might stumble onto some detail that exposes his role in the conspiracy." Clara felt a chill of fear. "How does he plan to?" "Prison accidents happen all the time. A fight between prisoners, a fall down the stairs, contaminated food." Margaret's voice grew urgent. "He has connections throughout the territorial government, including people in this prison. If you and Thaddeus are going to survive, you need to escape. Tonight." "That's impossible. This is a federal prison." "Nothing is impossible if you have help from the inside." Margaret pulled out a small piece of paper and slid it across the table. At midnight tonight, there will be a distraction in the east cell block. During the confusion, someone will unlock your cell and Thaddeus's cell. You'll have perhaps 10 minutes to reach the laundry delivery entrance on the south wall. Clara stared at the paper, which contained a roughly drawn map of the prison layout. Why would you do this? Why risk everything to help us? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting the wedding ring on her left hand. Because I destroyed Thaddeus's faith in love 5 years ago, and I've regretted it every day since. Because Henry isn't the man I thought I was marrying, he's a criminal who's killed innocent people to protect his schemes. And because sometimes doing the right thing is the only way to live with yourself. What about you? If Henry discovers your role in helping us, he won't discover it, because I won't be here. I'm leaving Denver tonight, and I won't be coming back. Margaret's voice grew stronger. I have enough evidence of Henry's crimes to keep me safe, as long as I stay far away from his reach. Clara studied the woman across from her, trying to judge her sincerity. Margaret had betrayed Thaddeus once before, choosing money and social position over love. Could she be trusted now? There's something else you need to know, Margaret said. The telegraph message that warned you about the investigation, that came from me. I tried to give you time to escape before the federal marshals arrived, but Henry moved faster than I expected. You sent the warning? I've been watching Henry's activities for months, trying to understand his business dealings. When I realized he was planning to frame you and Thaddeus for his own crimes, I sent the telegram hoping you'd have time to get away. Clara made her decision. Whether or not she trusted Margaret completely, the alternative was almost certain death at Henry Morrison's hands. What do we do once we escape? Get to Jonathan Crane's lawyer, Edgar Whitmore. I've sent him evidence of Henry's forgeries and a confession detailing everything I know about the conspiracy. If you can reach him alive, he can take the evidence to the territorial governor and demand a federal investigation. And if we're caught during the escape? Margaret's smile was sad but determined. Then at least you'll die fighting for your innocence instead of waiting to be murdered in your sleep. Clara folded the map and tucked it into her dress. Thank you, Mrs. Morrison, for giving us this chance. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you're both safe and free. Margaret stood to leave, then paused. Clara, may I call you Clara? Of course. Take care of him. Thaddeus is a good man who deserves better than the hand life has dealt him. He loves you, you know. I could see it in his eyes when the marshals arrested him. And I love him, Clara said simply, which is why I'm going to make sure we both survive this. As Margaret left the interview room, Clara felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. The escape would be dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but it was better than waiting passively for Henry Morrison to arrange their deaths. That evening, Clara lay on her narrow prison cot and went over the escape plan in her mind. At midnight, she and Thaddeus would have one chance to flee the most secure prison in the territory. If they succeeded, they would be fugitives with no resources and powerful enemies hunting them. If they failed, they would be dead. But as the clock on the prison wall ticked toward midnight, Clara felt no fear, only determination. She and Thaddeus had come too far and survived too much to give up now. Tomorrow, with luck and courage, they would be free to fight for their lives and their love. The sound of shouting from the east cell block announced that their desperate gamble was about to begin. The prison erupted in chaos at precisely midnight. Shouts and the sound of running feet echoed through the corridors as guards rushed toward the east cell block, where a fight between inmates had somehow escalated into a full riot. Clara pressed herself against her cell door, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps that would signal the beginning of their desperate escape attempt. A key turned in her lock, and the cell door swung open to reveal a guard she didn't recognize, a young man with nervous eyes and trembling hands. "Mrs. Crane," he whispered urgently, "we don't have much time. Follow me and stay quiet." Clara stepped out of her cell and followed the guard down a dimly lit corridor toward the center of the prison. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard over the distant sounds of the riot. But the guard moved with practiced efficiency through passages that seemed designed to confuse escaped prisoners. They reached a junction where another corridor branched off to the left, and Clara saw Thaddeus waiting in the shadows with a second guard. He looked thinner after their weeks of imprisonment, but his eyes were alert and determined. "Clara," he said softly, reaching for her hand as they were reunited. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, noting a bruise on his cheek that hadn't been there during their court appearance. "Nothing serious. Some of Morrison's friends in here tried to arrange an accident yesterday, but I convinced them to reconsider." Thaddeus's grip on her hand was strong and reassuring. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I can be." Their guard gestured for silence and led them deeper into the prison, following a route that seemed to wind through service areas and utility corridors. Clara realized they were moving through sections of the prison that most inmates would never see, areas where laundry was processed, food was prepared, and maintenance work was conducted. "There," the guard whispered, pointing to a heavy wooden door marked with a sign reading, "Authorized personnel only." "That leads to the loading dock, where laundry wagons pick up prison linens. There's a wagon waiting for you, but the driver won't wait long." Thaddeus pressed something into the guard's hand. Clara couldn't see what, but from the guard's expression, it was substantial. "Thank you for the risk you're taking." The guard nodded nervously. "Just remember what you promised about my sister's medical bills." "I'll remember," Thaddeus replied, and Clara realized he had somehow arranged financing for the guard's cooperation, even from inside his cell. They slipped through the service door and found themselves on a loading dock that overlooked the prison's rear courtyard. The area was darker than Clara had expected, lit only by a few scattered torches that created more shadows than illumination. A laundry wagon waited near the dock, its driver hunched on the seat with his hat pulled low. But something felt wrong. The driver's posture was too rigid, and Clara could see the shapes of several men positioned around the courtyard in positions that would provide clear fields of fire. "It's a trap," she whispered to Thaddeus. Before he could respond, torches flared to life around the courtyard, revealing at least a dozen armed men positioned to prevent any escape. Henry Morrison stepped out of the shadows near the wagon, his banker's suit replaced by practical clothing suitable for the dirty work of murder. "Mr. and Mrs. Crane," Morrison called out in a voice that carried easily across the courtyard. "How good of you to join us for this final meeting." Clara felt Thaddeus tense beside her, his hand moving toward the knife he had somehow acquired during his imprisonment. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped on the loading dock with no cover and no escape route. "Morrison," Thaddeus replied, his voice carrying anger but not fear. "I should have guessed you were behind all this. Wright was too obvious to be the real mastermind." Morrison laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the courtyard. "Samuel Wright was useful for a time, but ultimately expendable, rather like yourselves, actually." "Why?" Clara asked, stepping forward despite the danger. "Why go to all this trouble? Why not simply buy the ranch through legitimate means?" "Because legitimate means would have taken years and cost far more than the land was worth," Morrison replied. "The Diamond Bar sits on one of the most valuable railroad routes in the territory. My associates in the East were prepared to pay handsomely for guaranteed access to that land. So you forged Uncle Jonathan's will to create a situation where you could steal the ranch legally." "Jonathan Crane was a problem from the beginning. He refused every offer we made, no matter how generous. So yes, we created circumstances that would eventually transfer ownership to our company." Morrison's voice grew colder. "The marriage clause was particularly elegant. Whether you married or remained single, we would have gained control of the property." Thaddeus took a step forward, his hand now openly resting on his knife handle. "And my uncle, did you kill him too?" Jonathan was getting too close to discovering Wright's activities. He had to be eliminated before he could expose our entire operation. Morrison showed no remorse for the admission. "Arsenic in his evening brandy, administered over several weeks. He never suspected a thing. Clara felt rage building inside her at the casual way Morrison discussed murdering a kind, innocent man. And framing me for Fletcher's murder. Was that just convenient, or did you plan that from the beginning? Oh, that was planned from the very beginning, my dear. We needed someone to take the blame for Fletcher's death, and a mysterious woman with no connections in town was perfect for the role. Morrison's smile was predatory. Your arrest created the perfect conditions for Thaddeus to marry you out of misplaced gallantry, which triggered the inheritance clause and gave us legal grounds to claim the ranch. Except we proved my innocence and exposed Wright's role in the murder. A temporary setback, nothing more. We simply adjusted our strategy and framed both of you for the larger conspiracy. Morrison gestured to his men, who began closing in around the loading dock. But I'm afraid your luck has finally run out. Tonight you'll both die trying to escape from federal prison, and tomorrow the Territorial Land Development Company will take possession of the Diamond Bar Ranch. Clara looked around desperately for any means of escape, but Morrison's men had positioned themselves expertly. The only way off the loading dock was through them, and that would mean certain death in a hail of gunfire. But then she heard something that made her heart leap with hope. The sound of approaching horses, moving fast and in large numbers. Morrison heard it too, and his confident expression faltered as he realized his carefully planned execution was about to be interrupted. "What is that?" one of his men called out nervously. Morrison pulled out a pocket watch and checked the time, his face growing pale in the torchlight. "They're early," he muttered. "They weren't supposed to arrive until after." His words were cut off as a dozen mounted figures burst into the courtyard, their guns already drawn and aimed at Morrison's men. Clara recognized the leader immediately. It was Edgar Whitmore, Jonathan's lawyer, leading what appeared to be a mix of territorial marshals and federal agents. "Henry Morrison!" Whitmore's voice boomed across the courtyard with the authority of law and justice. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, multiple counts of murder and treason against the territory of Wyoming." Morrison's men hesitated, uncertain whether to fight or surrender in the face of this unexpected development. That moment of indecision was all Clara and Thaddeus needed to dive for cover behind a stack of laundry baskets as gunfire erupted across the courtyard. The battle in the prison courtyard was brief but intense. Morrison's men, caught between Whitmore's forces and the stone walls of the prison, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. Several threw down their weapons immediately, while others attempted to fight their way out, only to be overwhelmed by the superior numbers and positioning of the territorial marshals. Clara and Thaddeus remained behind their makeshift cover, listening to the sound of gunshots gradually diminishing as Morrison's resistance crumbled. When the shooting finally stopped, they cautiously raised their heads to see Henry Morrison on his knees in the center of the courtyard, his hands shackled behind his back and his expensive clothes torn and dusty. "It's over," Whitmore called out to them. "You can come out safely now." Clara felt Thaddeus take her hand as they emerged from behind the laundry baskets. She was wearing the plain grey dress of a federal prisoner, torn and stained from their desperate escape attempt, but she had never felt more beautiful or more alive. Edgar Whitmore approached them with a mixture of relief and anger on his weathered face. "Thank God you're both safe. When Margaret Morrison contacted me with evidence of her husband's crimes, I feared we might be too late to save you." "Margaret helped you?" Clara asked in amazement. "She provided us with detailed records of the forged documents, financial transactions, and correspondence that proved Henry's role in the conspiracy. Without her testimony, we never would have been able to move fast enough to prevent your executions." Whitmore gestured toward Morrison, who was being loaded into a prison wagon under heavy guard. "Henry Morrison has been orchestrating land fraud schemes across 3 territories for the past 5 years, using his position as a bank president to create false documentation and manipulate legal proceedings." Thaddeus stepped forward, his arm protectively around Clara's shoulders. "What about the charges against us? Are we still considered fugitives?" "All charges have been dropped," Whitmore replied with satisfaction. "The territorial governor has issued a full pardon for both of you, along with an official apology for the miscarriage of justice." The evidence Margaret provided was overwhelming. Every document used against you was a forgery. Every witness statement was fabricated. Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her face. After months of persecution, imprisonment, and fear, the nightmare was finally over. And the Diamond Bar Ranch? Fully restored to your legal ownership, along with compensation for the cattle that was stolen and the property damage caused by Morrison's associates. Whitmore's expression grew warmer. Jonathan would be proud of how you both fought for justice and for each other. As they were escorted from the prison grounds in a carriage provided by the territorial government, Clara marveled at how quickly their circumstances had changed. Hours ago, they had been condemned prisoners facing execution for crimes they didn't commit. Now, they were free citizens with their names cleared and their property restored. But more than that, Clara realized as she sat beside Thaddeus in the carriage, they had survived something that would have destroyed most couples. Their marriage had begun as a desperate arrangement between strangers, but it had been forged into something real and unbreakable through shared danger and mutual trust. "There's something I need to tell you," Thaddeus said as the prison disappeared behind them in the darkness. "Something I should have said weeks ago." Clara looked at him expectantly, noting the nervous tension in his voice. "When I first proposed this marriage, I told you it was purely a business arrangement. I said we could have it annulled or quietly divorced once the inheritance was secured." Thaddeus turned to face her directly. "I lied, Clara. Not about the business aspects, those were real enough, but about my feelings." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I fell in love with you the moment I saw you in that jail cell, sitting there with such dignity despite your circumstances. Everything I've done since then, investigating Fletcher's murder, fighting Wright's men, risking my life to protect you, none of it was about the ranch or the inheritance." Thaddeus's voice grew stronger as he continued. "It was about you, Clara. It was about a woman who was brave enough to marry a stranger, strong enough to survive imprisonment and persecution, and generous enough to forgive me for dragging her into this mess." Clara felt her heart racing as she absorbed his words. "Thaddeus, I know this complicates things," he said quickly. "I know you agreed to a temporary arrangement, and I'll honor that agreement if that's what you want. But I had to tell you the truth before we returned to the ranch, because I can't pretend anymore that this is just business between us." Clara was quiet for so long that Thaddeus began to fear he had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps she really did want their marriage to be temporary. Perhaps the affection he thought he had seen in her eyes had been nothing more than gratitude for his help in proving her innocence. "Do you remember what I told you about my parents?" Clara asked finally. "You said they had the kind of love that poets write about." "They did. They loved each other completely, passionately, with the kind of devotion that most people only dream of." Clara's voice grew soft with memory. "I swore I would never settle for anything less than what they had." Thaddeus felt his heart sinking. "And you don't think—" "I think," Clara interrupted, placing her hand over his, "that I found exactly what they had. With a man who was brave enough to marry a condemned murderess and stubborn enough to fight the world to prove her innocence." The carriage had stopped in front of a small hotel where they would spend the night before beginning the journey back to Redemption Bluff. But neither of them moved to get out. "Clara," Thaddeus said carefully, "are you saying—" "I'm saying that I love you, Thaddeus Crane. Not out of gratitude, not out of convenience, but because you're the most honorable, courageous, and kind man I've ever known." Clara's voice was clear and certain. "I'm saying that if you'll have me, I want to be your wife, not just in name, but in every way that matters." Thaddeus leaned forward and kissed her then, finally allowing himself to express the feelings he had been holding back for weeks. It was their first real kiss as husband and wife, and it tasted of freedom, hope, and the promise of a future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, Clara was breathless and laughing. So much for a marriage of convenience. The most inconvenient marriage in the history of the territory. Thaddeus agreed, his eyes bright with happiness. Thank God for that. As they entered the hotel, Clara couldn't help but think about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to Redemption Bluff, seeking a fresh start after losing everything she held dear. Instead, she had found herself accused of murder, facing execution, and ultimately married to a man she barely knew. But sometimes, she reflected, the best things in life came disguised as disasters. Her arrest had led to her marriage to Thaddeus. The attempt to frame them both had revealed the depth of their feelings for each other. Even their imprisonment had strengthened their bond and proved that they could face anything together. Tomorrow they would return to the Diamond Bar Ranch as husband and wife, in every sense of the words. They would rebuild what Morrison's conspiracy had tried to destroy, and they would do it together. But tonight, as Clara prepared for bed in their hotel room, she felt nothing but gratitude for the unexpected path that had led her to love. The nightmare was over. The dream was just beginning. 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of the Diamond Bar Ranch house, watching the sun rise over the valley, where cattle grazed peacefully in the morning light. The view was as beautiful as ever, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The ranch itself showed signs of renewal and growth. New fencing had been installed to replace what Morrison's men had damaged. Additional outbuildings had been constructed to support the expanded cattle operation, and the house itself had been transformed from a bachelor's functional dwelling into a true family home. But the most significant changes were less visible. The ranch hands moved with the confidence of men who knew their jobs were secure and their boss valued their contributions. Mrs. Rodriguez hummed as she worked in the kitchen, pleased to finally have a lady of the house who appreciated her efforts and treated her as family rather than hired help. Even the cattle seemed more content, as if they sensed the stability and care that now guided the ranch's operations. Clara wore a dress of deep blue silk, one of several new gowns Thaddeus had insisted on buying for her during their trip to Denver to testify at Henry Morrison's trial. Around her throat hung a simple gold necklace, Thaddeus's wedding gift, to replace the faded locket that had been lost during their imprisonment. But the most precious adornment was the gold wedding band on her finger, not the practical band from their hasty jail ceremony, but a new ring they had chosen together, engraved with their initials and the date of their real wedding. That second wedding ceremony had taken place 2 months after their return to Redemption Bluff, when the townspeople had finally accepted that Clara was innocent of all wrongdoing and deserving of their respect. The ceremony had been held in the town's small church, with half the territory in attendance to celebrate not just their marriage, but their triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy them. "Good morning, Mrs. Crane," Thaddeus said, emerging from the house to join her on the porch. He carried 2 cups of coffee and wore the satisfied expression of a man who had found everything he ever wanted. "Good morning, Mr. Crane," Clara replied, accepting her coffee with a smile. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," Thaddeus said, settling into the chair beside hers. "Though I'm still not used to waking up and finding all of this is real." Clara knew exactly what he meant. Sometimes she still expected to wake up in her jail cell and discover that everything, the vindication, the love, the perfect life they had built together, had been nothing more than a desperate dream. "Any word from Edgar about Morrison's appeal?" she asked. "His lawyers filed their motion yesterday, but Edgar doesn't think it will be successful. The evidence against Morrison is overwhelming, and his associates have been cooperating with the government in exchange for reduced sentences." Thaddeus sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Justice moves slowly, but it's moving in the right direction." Henry Morrison had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to hang, though his execution had been delayed while various legal appeals worked their way through the territorial court system. Samuel Wright and Jake Morrison had both been executed for their roles in Benjamin Fletcher's murder, their deaths bringing a sense of closure to that chapter of the story. Margaret Morrison had testified against her husband in exchange for immunity from prosecution. then had disappeared into the anonymity of a large eastern city. Clara sometimes wondered what had become of the woman who had risked everything to help them escape, but she bore Margaret no ill will. People made mistakes, and Margaret had done her best to make amends for hers. "There's something I want to discuss with you," Thaddeus said, his tone growing more serious. "Something about our future." Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Despite all they had been through together, despite the love they had declared and the life they were building, she sometimes feared that Thaddeus might grow tired of their unconventional beginning and yearn for a more traditional wife. "What about our future?" she asked carefully. "I've been thinking about what we want to accomplish with the ranch, with our lives together." Thaddeus set down his coffee cup and turned to face her directly. "The Diamond Bar is more successful now than it's ever been, and we have more money than we could spend in a lifetime. But I keep thinking there should be more to our legacy than cattle and land." "What did you have in mind?" "I want to establish a school," Thaddeus said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "A proper school for the children of ranch families and townspeople, with books and supplies, and a teacher who cares about education." Clara felt her heart leap with excitement. "You want me to teach again?" "Only if that's what you want. I know you gave up teaching when you came west, but I've seen how you light up when you talk about your students in Kansas. I thought perhaps you might like to return to what you loved." Clara set down her own coffee cup and moved to stand beside Thaddeus, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You would do that for me? Build a school just so I could teach?" "I would do anything for you, Clara. But more than that, I think the territory needs what you have to offer. Good teachers are rare out here, and children deserve the same quality of education whether they live in cities or on ranches." The idea filled Clara with a joy she hadn't felt since her teaching days in Kansas. To have the opportunity to shape young minds again, to help children discover the wonder of learning and the power of knowledge, it would be a dream come true. "There's something else," Thaddeus continued. "Edgar has been in contact with several other ranching families who are interested in supporting the school. We could make it a regional institution, serving children from across 3 counties. Clara threw her arms around Thaddeus and kissed him with all the love and gratitude in her heart. "Yes," she said when they finally broke apart. "Yes to the school, yes to teaching, yes to building something wonderful together." As they held each other on the porch where their love had first begun to bloom, Clara reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to Redemption Bluff as a broken woman seeking refuge from grief and loss. She had nearly died for a crime she didn't commit, had been imprisoned and persecuted by powerful men who saw her as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. But through it all, she had found something more precious than gold, a love that could survive any trial, a partnership built on trust and mutual respect, and a future bright with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "Do you ever regret it?" Thaddeus asked quietly. "The way we met, the circumstances of our marriage?" Clara considered the question seriously. Their marriage had begun in desperation and been tested by forces that would have destroyed most couples. They had faced false accusations, imprisonment, and the very real possibility of death. A conventional courtship would certainly have been easier and less traumatic, but a conventional courtship would also have been less revealing of their true characters. They had seen each other at their worst and their best, had supported each other through impossible circumstances, and had chosen love even when it would have been safer to walk away. "No regrets," Clara said firmly. "Not about any of it. If I had to live through everything again, the arrest, the trial, the imprisonment, all of it, I would do it gladly for the chance to end up here with you. Even the hangman's noose." "Even that," Clara said with a laugh, "though I hope our future adventures will be somewhat less dramatic." Thaddeus pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at the perfect contentment he felt in this moment. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and peaceful. The woman he loved was in his arms, planning a future that would benefit not just themselves, but countless children who would benefit from her teaching. Sometimes, he thought. The best stories begin with the words, "I need a wife and you need a way out." Sometimes the most desperate bargains lead to the most wonderful discoveries, and sometimes the people we save end up saving us in return. As the sun climbed higher over the valley, warming the earth and promising another beautiful day, Clara and Thaddeus began to discuss the details of their school, how large it should be, where it should be built, what subjects Clara would teach. But beneath their practical planning ran a current of deeper satisfaction, the knowledge that they had found in each other not just a spouse, but a true partner in all of life's adventures. The Diamond Bar Ranch had been saved, their names had been cleared, and justice had been served. But more than that, two lonely people had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as disasters, and that love can bloom even in the darkest circumstances. Their story had begun with a desperate proposition in a jail cell. It would continue for the rest of their lives as they built something beautiful together, a marriage, a family, a legacy that would touch the lives of everyone fortunate enough to know them. As Clara often told her students years later, the best adventures always begin when you have the courage to say yes to an impossible proposition. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that impossible proposition turns out to be the beginning of everything you never knew you wanted.